There's a lot of reasons to think that we're pretty close to peak emissions, which doesn't mean that, to stop global warming entirely, you basically need to get to zero emissions. But when you put that all together, it's really hard to get much beyond 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century, as opposed to this, 5 degrees that everyone just a decade ago thought we were headed towards. With, close to 1.5 degrees of warming today, the overwhelming trend that we continue to see is people migrating towards climate hazards, not away from them. So into flood zones, into coastal regions, because that's where economic opportunity is. I have become more and more skeptical about geoengineering. I think the most plausible scenario for climate catastrophe is that we start geoengineering and then we stop.
Welcome to Saving the World from Bad Ideas. I'm Mark Lynas, and I've had a few bad ideas in my time. I used to go out in the nighttime to destroy GMO crops, and I also opposed nuclear power. But then when I looked at the science, I found I got it wrong. Oops! I've learned the hard way that none of us are right all the time. So now I'm here to challenge the assumptions that we all too often take for granted, because the future depends on us getting it right. Hello and welcome to another episode of Saving the World from Bad Ideas. I'm with Ted NordHaus today, an old friend of mine and executive director of the Breakthrough Institute, which is an eco-modernist think tank based in California. And Ted's also the co-author of An Ecomodernist Manifesto, alongside yours truly, which was published, I think, back in 2015, and alongside many others, some of whom shall not be named. But Ted, welcome to the podcast.
Good to finally kind of get together and do this. So looking forward
to
it.
Yeah, you've been on our list of desired invitees for a long time, so it's great to have you. We have to start off with a bad idea, and I thought we'd put forward producer Rob, nod if this is good enough for you, but so we thought we'd have your bad idea as climate catastrophism, because you've just written a piece taking that on, and how does that work? Is climate catastrophism a bad idea?
Climate catastrophism is definitely a bad idea. So, as you said, I recently wrote an essay about why I'm no longer a climate catastrophist. I think I started out like a lot of people hearing about this thing called climate change and hearing that scientists were saying that if we didn't take sort of immediate, very far-reaching action, it was going to be the end of the world. And over a lot of years, I've come to realize that there are some scientists who sort of say that, but if you look at the actual science, the science tells a much more sort of nuanced and complicated story. So I kind of wrote about sort of some of the ways that my views on this have changed over a lot of years, from that initial pretty catastrophist view that I held myself to a view now where I believe that climate change is real, it's happening, it's a problem, we should do something about it. And I feel like at the Breakthrough Institute, and really through sort of the creation of eco-modernism, a part of what I at least feel like I have been up to has been making a non-catastrophist and non-apocalyptic case for climate action. That we don't have to believe that it's the end of the world, or that it's going to destroy human societies or lead to human extinction, to have very good reasons to think that we should do something about the problem. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to go and sort of reorganize the entire global economy over the course of a decade or two to do it. But even with all the sort of catastrophist claims and rhetoric, we were never going to do that anyway. So happy to talk a little bit more about kind of how I view like the underlying science and how we should think about climate risk and some of the kind of, I think particularly some of the claims around sort of the role that climate change is playing in present day natural disasters. Obviously there's a lot to unpack there. So
there really is, and absolutely there really is. It seems an odd time to write a piece declaring you're no longer a climate catastrophist when we're imminently crossing the 1.5 degree Paris Agreement limit. The speed of warming seems to be accelerating. There's some pretty scary stuff I've read about that. And meanwhile, the Trump administration is trying to get the whole world hooked back on fossil fuels. So I want to really get a measure of what the parameters are of your thesis here. Are you a lukewarmer who now believes that the planet is going to warm less than you did before? Or is it more about, yes, the planet's going to warm by the same amount roughly, but the impacts are going to be more manageable or not as bad in some way?
A little bit of both. So the first place to start is that I think that if you went back a decade ago, I think most people thought that we were on track for 5+ degrees of warming. I mean, you wrote a book called 6 Degrees. And really, when you look at the sort of trajectory of the global economy, those have turned out to be were they not sort of business as usual scenarios. But it's really hard to get there even in kind of worst case scenarios by the end of this century. And the reason for that...
You mean it's hard to get to 4 to 5 to 6 degrees of warming by the end of the century.
Yeah. Right.
I agree. Okay.
And there's a bunch of reasons for that. The first is that we're watching, I wouldn't call it population collapse, but we are going to hit peak population much sooner than what people thought even a decade ago. So as opposed to being on track for 10, 11 million people by mid-to-late century, I think increasingly it looks like we may be lucky or unlucky, depending on your perspective, to hit 9 billion people before population peaks, and then it's going to decline. And we see all over the world, most of the world is in some version of sort of negative fertility rates or below replacement rates. So population is peaking and stabilizing much faster than anyone thought. There are various assumptions. I think people, especially, 10, 15, 20 years ago, were looking at growth rates in China and going, oh my God, if you just sort of project that out linearly, we're going to have massive economic growth and massively increased energy consumption. And energy consumption is definitely going to increase a fair amount. But the reality is that most developed economies today are struggling with growth rates. We call it secular stagnation sometimes, but most advanced developed economies are going to struggle to maintain 2% annual economic growth over the course of this century. And then the global economy and national economies continues to decarbonize. There's a distinction between absolute decarbonization, where globally you hit a peak of carbon emissions and they start to fall. And then there's what's called relative decarbonization, which just means that the carbon intensity of each additional unit of economic output is lower than the last unit. And there's very robust trends. Obviously, we can talk about some of the really promising things that have happened with renewable energy over the last decade or so. But there's a lot of reasons to think that we're pretty close to peak emissions, which doesn't mean that, stop global warming entirely. You basically need to get to zero emissions. But when you put that all together, it's really hard to get much beyond 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century, as opposed to this 5 degrees that everyone just a decade ago thought we were headed towards. So
let me stop you there. Yeah. And since you kindly mentioned my book, 6 Degrees, I copied and pasted some of the 3 degrees chapter, right? So these are some of the impacts that we might see before the end of the century, at least in a 3-degree world. It makes us as hot as the Pliocene, which is about 3 million years ago. And then there's crocodiles in the Arctic. So a very different world. Could mean sea level rise in the worst case scenario as high as just under 2 meters. So that displaces a few hundred million people. Puts a lot of South Asia into the extremely dangerous heat zone. 50 million people exposed to temperatures on the wet bulb scale, which are above the kind of biological survivability threshold. Drought magnitudes increase by 500%. Glacier mass in the Himalayas decreases by half. We lose 90% of the ice in the Andes and the European Alps. And it's bad, particularly bad for ecology. And this is probably something we should come back to. Half of insects, quarter of mammals, nearly half of plants, and fifth of birds lose half of their climatic range. So it really is devastating for biodiversity. And 12 million square kilometers of Arctic permafrost, which is about 3/4 of the global total, is now in the melt zone. So that's releasing both CO2 and methane. And of course, there's no sea ice in the Arctic at all in the summer. So that doesn't meet your definition of a catastrophe.
No, actually, it doesn't. I mean, I would just say that obviously you wrote that book over a decade ago, and you can go and dig in. The more I dig into these impact studies, the more I'm like, they're kind of, I don't want to say they're dodgy, but they're quite stylized in a variety of ways, particularly when you start getting to things like assumed adaptation of agriculture, the time frames that we're talking about. So if you were telling me 2 meters of sea level rise over a couple of decades, I'd be very concerned. When we're talking about 2 meters of sea level rise over the course of a century or more, I get a lot less concerned about that. And I don't believe these sort of climate displacement numbers at all. And in fact, the overwhelming, with close to 1.5 degrees of warming today, the overwhelming trend that we continue to see is people migrating towards climate hazards, not away from them. So into flood zones, into coastal regions, because that's where economic opportunity is. So if you kind of go like, there is this story that there's, and you can see claims that a whole lot of this migration is already being driven by climate change, but actually there's just very little evidence that that's what's driving the vast majority of migration globally, and that in fact people are moving towards climate hazards, which also tend to be more developed areas that are less vulnerable to those hazards and have better infrastructure. Economic development has huge benefits. And again, for all of this with a 1.5 degrees, so we're halfway to 3, right? And what we see is that the numbers around things like climate mortality associated with extreme climatic events of all kinds, has collapsed. This year, unless there's some really quite extreme event or a very terrible loss of life due to some kind of major climate event in the last 3 months of this year will likely be the lowest loss of life due to climate extremes, certainly in recorded human history.
And last year was as well, right? 2024 was also.
Yeah, I mean, these trends are, this is a very, very robust long-term trend.
And I agree with you. People don't know that. People tend to think, I guess if you were to ask the ordinary person who's concerned about climate change, do you think more people are dying in climate disasters or fewer? They'd say more. And that's wrong. Yeah. And so these are there's this, but that's not because climate change isn't happening. Just to be clear about this, it's because humans are adapting and becoming less vulnerable. I mean, what's driving that change?
Well, it's two things. I mean, the first is exactly what you just said, which is that human societies are quite adaptable. Even, before the modern era, we had human populations living across a range of extraordinary climate variability, from Arctic regions to subtropical regions to highly desertified regions. And you look at the range of kind of climatic conditions that even sort of modern, pre-industrial humans had adapted to, and it's a quite remarkable range. So then you obviously bring all of the benefits of sort of modern, advanced, industrial, urbanized societies, hardened infrastructure, modern energy services, modern emergency response, transportation networks that allow people to kind of get out of harm's way, forecasting. I mean, I can go on and on and on and on, all the things that make us much, much more resilient to climatic extremes, having nothing to do with climate change. Remember, the climate has always been extreme, and the climate has always been dangerous, just simply due to natural variability. And then you bring all of this adaptive capacity that comes with technology, societal affluence, infrastructure, institutions, all that whole package of things. And virtually everyone on the planet is vastly more resilient to climatic extremes today than they were 20 years ago, than they were 50 years ago, than they were 100 years ago.
Yeah, I've seen this in Bangladesh, actually, where I think there was a cyclone in the 70s which killed 250,000 people. It was absolutely horrifying. And
it was a 500,000.
500,000. There we are. And then, right. And, well, you tell the story then, because I think you know what I'm going to say.
Cyclone Bola in 1970. It was a quite severe cyclone. And again, you have to remember that this was a very severe cyclone really prior to the period that you could conceivably kind of observe or even predict theoretically much effect from climate change on tropical cyclones. But it hit a very, very poor country And it hit a very, very poor country that was in the midst of a civil war. Bangladesh was attempting to achieve independence from Pakistan. And of course, this is where we see really terrible natural disasters of all sorts, whether they're climate related or not. It's at the intersection of a natural hazard, whether it's an earthquake or a cyclone or a flood or something else, and failed states, wars, poverty. You put those two things together and you get really bad outcomes.
So the cyclone hits in 1970, kills 500,000 people. And I think the same intensity cyclone hit relatively recently, and a couple of dozen at the most people died.
Yeah, I don't think there's been a tropical cyclone in Bangladesh that has killed more than 10 or 20 people for at least a decade, maybe longer than that.
Right. And that's to do with forecasting. It's to do with shelters. It's to do with evacuations. It's to do with,
these are all adaptations. A lot richer, too. Bangladesh is sort of on the verge of being a middle-income country from having been truly one of the poorest countries in the world. I mean, it's quite a remarkable story. And Bangladesh has been in the midst of some political turmoil more recently. But, even so, societal affluence, and that's both sort of private wealth and public wealth, makes a huge difference in terms of people's vulnerability to extreme climatic events of all sorts. So I've told you I work with the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is 74 of the world's most climate vulnerable countries, and how that's defined isn't so much to do with geography, whether you're a small island state or something. It's really to do with socioeconomic capacity to deal with the impacts of climate change. And so that's why the first thing these countries are asking for, alongside mitigation, is help, is financial help for adaptation, which is only fair given that they're not the ones who caused the problem. Yeah. I mean, that is an interesting debate. And I've written elsewhere that I kind of think they're barking up the wrong tree. I just don't think this sort of loss and damages is ever going to deliver what I think a lot of very poor countries hope it will deliver. But it is absolutely the case that most of the climate change has been overwhelmingly the result of emissions from rich countries, and the places and the people who are most vulnerable to it live in very poor countries. But, it's also important to Bangladesh is not remotely an exception. I mean, it's why we see this incredible decline in loss of life due to climate extremes, is that the whole world has gotten a lot richer, even people in the poor countries. And we see the numbers around the reductions in the number of people living in extreme poverty. And I think people reasonably say that that should not be our goal, is to get people from being incredibly, extremely poor to just really poor. And there's still a lot of people all over the world who are really poor. But even going from being in real extreme poverty to just a little less poor actually turns out to make a huge difference in terms of vulnerability to climatic extremes. So that is one part of the story here, right? It's these adaptive capacities, it's economic growth, it's adaptation, it's infrastructure, it's all these things. The other part of the story, though, around sort of, again, why I've become a lot less catastrophist, is that, again, even with 1.5 degrees of warming, when you kind of look at how much that amplifies extreme events, just the actual climate hazard, how much hotter is the heat wave, how much more intense by various measures is the hurricane or the tropical cyclone or the flood. The impact that climate change has is really on the margins of natural variability. So the heat wave that without climate change, that with the heat wave that we experience today, that 5 days above, for your audience, I'll do this in Celsius, which is hard.
Yeah, please, centigrade, yeah.
But that's above, say, 40, you get 4 days or 5 days above, where the high temperature over 5 days above 40 degrees Celsius. Well, it's not like and you get this very misleading, what's called single event attribution, which is
this is when they say it's 50 times more likely because
it's 50 times more likely. than without climate change. And so, like, for a lay person, and you read the headline and you read the story in the newspaper, or hear it on, I guess we don't read newspapers anymore. So however we get that little factoid, it's a reasonable understanding to go, okay, so that means that the heat wave would not have happened except for climate change. Well, that is not at all what these single event attribution studies are finding. What they're finding, and when they say it's 50 times more likely, what they're saying is that it was, and it's a complicated, it's hard to explain simply, but basically,
good. We like complexity. So take your time.
Right. So basically, the heat wave that hit 40°C for 5 days, without climate change, there would still have been a very severe heat wave. It just would have been, let's say, 38°C over those 5 days instead of 40°C. And so when they say, well, it's like 50 times more likely, it's actually kind of a tautological claim. And just an extreme heat wave is like the best example of it, because it's literally like you're just kind of mostly just adding the anthropogenic average warming to the high temperature. So it's a little more complicated than that statistically and in the modeling and all that. But basically, anthropogenic warming is turning the 38-degree high temperature heat wave to a 40-degree high temperature heat wave. And it is true, that is extremely unlikely without climate change. But without climate change, you would still have had a very, very extreme climatic event that, if you had 1,000 people who died in this heat wave, as we've seen in some of these bad heat waves that we've seen across Europe, which is not, well, despite being very wealthy, actually, like Europeans do really, really badly in heat waves.
Your houses aren't built for it, and it's old people.
Houses aren't built for it. The people kind of aren't adapted to it.
There's no AC either, which you apparently have in the US.
Yes, we have too much of it, probably. But anyway, so the reality is that a fair amount, most of that mortality would have happened at 38 degrees as well as much as it did in 40 degrees. And you can kind of start splitting hairs about, is it 1,000 people versus 800 or something like that? But like, that's the effect that climate change is having. And this is like the clearest case we have of climate impacting the climate hazard that is being experienced today. And you can see other examples of it that are fairly clear-cut in various cases, like because the atmosphere holds more water vapor when it's warming, you get a 10-ish% increase in precipitation in like extreme precipitation events, whether that's just an extreme rainfall event or a tropical cyclone or that kind of thing. And there's also things that work the other way. So, for instance, like, I can't remember if you get less or more wind shear makes it harder for tropical cyclones to form, and climate change reduces or increases wind shear.
It depends where you are. It's that is complex.
So and you start getting into really complex things, and there's factors sort of driving in either direction. And so the result of that is that when you start looking at long-term trends as opposed to these single event attribution things, like, it's very difficult in most, certainly globally, and even in a lot of regional contexts, to find much a very clear climate signal in terms of intensification of extreme climatic events beyond just temperature in most regions. And even where you can find them, they're not particularly large factors. So you have this natural climate variability. It remains the main event. It will remain the main event in extreme climatic phenomena of all sorts, certainly through this century. And the thing that determines what the consequences are of these events is how many people are in harm's way and how well adapted, how vulnerable they are to these events. And again, that is mostly a socioeconomic and sort of institutional and human societies question. It's not a warming question. So, that, as I kind of got my head around that, and to get your head around, for me, that was not just about being like, well, the mortality is going down, and if you normalize the economic costs, they're flat. And if you further really account for what the trend is in terms of share of economic output in actual affected regions, there's pretty good examples that actually the cost of these extreme climatic events relative to the overall sort of GDP, economic output, wealth in harm's way has actually been falling. And so for me, it's yes, climate change will continue given the trajectory that global emissions and the global population, global economy, and technology are on. We're going to see more warming. Climate change will continue to moderately intensify some extreme events. And I think the likelihood is that human societies will actually continue to become more resilient to those events, not less resilient. And so then when you get to these really catastrophic claims and sort of frankly fantasies, and you have to ask yourself, well, what would have to happen to go back to, say, the kinds of sort of mortality rates that we saw in, say, 1970, much less 1920 or 1880, without some real catastrophe having nothing to do with climate change, like the world just descends into sort of failed states and
nuclear war, which we've both written a joint op-ed about, and I think it was the Wall Street Journal, right?
Right.
If you want to kill a few billion people, that's the way to do it. Not long, slow climate change.
Exactly. And it's like in the aftermath of the nuclear war, whoever survives will be much more vulnerable to climate change. But that's kind of it's almost laughable to be concerned about it in that way, right?
Nuclear winter is a climate change, just in the opposite direction.
It is absolutely anthropogenic climate change.
Yeah. I guess where most people go with this, maybe in pushing back to you, would be to talk about tipping points. And I've put the collapse of the Amazon in my 3 degrees chapter. It's very uncertain. All the tipping points are very uncertain, which is one of the issues here. It's difficult to quantify when these things will happen. The models all say different things, but these are probably genuine features in the Earth system. They've tipped before in different geological eras which have been warmer. Do you not lose any sleep over the Amazon, the Arctic?
I mean, I lose a lot of sleep over it, but not because it's going to kill all the people. I lose sleep over the Amazon because I think the Amazon is just an incredible sort of source of biodiversity and wonder and beauty and complexity and evolutionary sort of, I can't even tell you it's exact. I couldn't actually quantify why I care about the Amazon, but I care about the Amazon, not because I think that it's at risk of collapse. And if it collapses, it's going to produce a human catastrophe. And just if you go to what is the real threat to the Amazon? It's not climate change, it's deforestation. Deforestation contributes to climate change. But when you look at you look at all of the kind of almost all of the recent work on sort of what is driving these dynamics in the Amazon that if they kind of continue amidst all this uncertainty could create collapse. It's not climate change. It is literally just the thing that leads to the collapse of the Amazon is just cutting down all the trees, or not all the trees, but you get to a tipping point where you clear enough of the forest that it stops doing the thing.
The hydrological thing, yeah.
Hydrological thing, right? So it's I also don't think that's likely to be, again, catastrophic for human societies, but it will be absolutely catastrophic for the Amazon and all of the biodiversity there. And we should try to stop the deforestation. And I don't need to believe that there's a looming human apocalypse to want to save the Amazon. It's absurd.
Would you say the same for coral reefs? I mean, I've seen coral reef bleaching in real time in the Maldives and elsewhere. And there's no doubt this is driven by warming. I mean, the marine heat waves.
Yeah, and it is one of the real direct biodiversity consequences. And again, I think that, I mean, and this is where it gets hard, right? Like one, even if we lose most of the coral reefs, again, I don't think it will be a human catastrophe. People are like, oh, there's all these people who depend on the coral reefs, but the coral reefs go away, certainly in the context of sort of continuing social and economic modernization. I don't think this is going to be like a catastrophe for a material catastrophe for human societies. It will be a catastrophe for biodiversity. And it will be due to climate change. I mean, there's other factors, right? But climate change is going to have is going to be responsible for a lot of that. And honestly, I don't think you're going to convince 2 to 3 billion Chinese and Indians not to continue to pursue economic development and sort of economic modernity to save the coral reefs. It's unfortunate. I wouldn't say it's unfortunate for the coral reefs and all we're going to lose. I'm enough of a humanist to be like, I can understand why the Chinese and the Indians and the Africans, if they have the opportunity, are not going to turn away from continuing economic development to save coral reefs.
Although, I mean, it's a bit more optimistic than that, in that China's rapid economic development is now largely driving the global clean energy transition.
Right. Yeah. And of course, in that way too, it's also very double-edged. If we're going to lose the coral reefs at 2 degrees, then kind of we're going to lose. We better figure out, if we want to save that, we better figure out how to genetically engineer coral, or maybe I'm a skeptical of solar geoengineering, but there's a set of other ways that you could theoretically save a lot of those coral reefs. But I think it's extremely unlikely you're going to do it by keeping global warming well below 2 degrees.
I want to shift the conversation back to politics a bit. I mean, we're in a different place. If you'd written this piece maybe, before Trump, I guess, at least Trump.
Well, I sort of did. I actually wrote it, and I wrote a different version of this for a magazine called New Atlantis in the spring of 2024. And
okay,
I wrote.
Did you get cancelled? I mean, I was going to say, if this would have got you cancelled a few years ago when the climate movement felt very powerful, it feels now like it's very much on the back foot. I mean, climate denialism is now the official policy of the United States. Trump stood up in front of the UN and said climate change was a hoax. I mean, you can't get much more blatant than that. So, what function does it serve pushing back against the climate sort of demagoguery now, if you want to characterize it that way?
Well, I mean, honestly, I think it's important to kick it when it's down.
That's kind of you. That's a nice philosophy to have, isn't it?
I mean, I think that if you kind of go well, how did we get here? There's a lot of reasons that we got here, but one not insignificant one was the climate movement and the huge backlash that we've had to the climate movement, in part because of these apocalyptic and catastrophic claims, in part because it just became kind of part of what do people call it? The unicause, the monocause.
Is that the kind of general wokery sort of thing?
Yeah, it's climate change and Palestine and George Floyd and every other kind of lefty progressive issue all folded up together. But the climate issue, I think, if you kind of go and I wrote a piece recently, a series of essays about sort of Marx and ecology, and the way that Marx gets sort of repurposed to the captured by environment. Well, Marx himself didn't, but the sort of post-60s sort of left kind of repurposes Marx to kind of suddenly become an ecologist. And this is all part and parcel of sort of liberal and leftist parties all over the world becoming increasingly alienated from working class constituencies, which even in rich, developed countries sort of still typically hold the balance of power. And I personally believe that the kind of integration of sort of, according to Hoyle, environmentalism into the sort of ideology and sort of praxis of center left and leftist parties all over the developed world over the last generation has had a lot to do with the kind of departure of working class constituencies.
But can you evidence that? I mean, how do you know? Does polling show that environmentalism is that unpopular?
It shows that most of the things that environmentalists want to do, like so when the rubber hits the road on climate and a lot of other issues, it's basically things that make energy more expensive, that often make food more expensive, that make transportation more expensive. And if you're kind of well-educated, high socioeconomic status, kind of talking heads like you and me, and we live in these sort of, well, I guess you don't live in one as much as I do, maybe, when I'm not in New Mexico.
Depends what you're talking about. What do I live in? Big house?
These sort of urban, sort of coastal, it just doesn't affect me. Like $5 gasoline, which has most of the United States just up in arms, doesn't affect me that much. I don't drive that much. I don't
care. I have an EV, but I mean, it does cost me £400 a month because it's new. So that's something that somebody wouldn't be able to pay on a very low income.
Yeah. So, like when you start talking about like, we're going to phase out internal combustion vehicles in 10 years. And here's our carbon price that just like raised the cost of petrol by $1 a gallon. And suddenly your electricity prices, your monthly electricity bill, because we're, pushing lots of wind and solar and various other things to electric, like that, if you're like a working class household, if you're in the sort of bottom half of the income distribution, that's a way bigger share of your income than it is for people like you and me. And we've been doing this in various ways for decades. And like one of the things that I think sort of center-right and right-wing and sort of populist parties figure out is that this stuff is really, really unpopular, and especially the policies. So it's one thing, people don't like it when the price of gasoline is high. They really don't like it when some part of that is due to a party that has decided that climate change is really a big problem, deciding to establish a carbon tax that's responsible for it. And you can go, and there's a whole literature on the fact that these taxes, gas taxes, carbon taxes, things like that, are just much, much more salient for voters than either sort of price increases that aren't at least so obviously the result of policy decisions, and particularly taxes of one sort or another, and also other sorts of taxes. Like, you would be hard-pressed, certainly in the United States, I'm less knowledgeable, you'd be hard-pressed to find any tax that is as unpopular in the United States as a gas tax.
I mean, it's very, I think the whole clean energy transition has been very regressive, probably, in terms of its impact on income distribution.
Yeah, there's lots of evidence for that. And in fact, once upon a time, people admitted it, like when you had these, like James Hansen and other people were very into these sort of cap and dividend things where you would put your carbon tax on, but then like everyone would get this dividend. And you could sort of see these economic analyses that would show that if you kind of did it that way, it was more equitable and less regressive. But before I kind of started writing screeds about climate catastrophism and things like that, and manifestos, I was a pollster for a lot of years. And I actually moderated some of the very first focus groups, like testing these various sorts of environmental tax shifting ideas. The things that you saw is that people had no doubt that you were going to raise their taxes and raise the cost of things for them. And they were completely cynical and disbelieving that they would ever get the money would ever be refunded to them.
Well, they'd be right. It's not happened. I mean, the taxes are there, and in Europe, it's happened through an emissions trading scheme, which means that the income's gone to the big companies who are doing the polluting. I mean, it's been grandfathered, and it couldn't be worse than that in terms of any
Right.
kind of equality
Well, no, you end up,
scenario.
like a decade plus ago when I'm not sure if it was my original cancel. I've been canceled like 6 times, Mark.
You're ahead
But
of me, damn you.
one of the things that I got canceled for was just sort of, we started putting out analyses of like what the Waxman-Markey, which was the big U.S. cap and trade proposal, like how much emission, like when you factored in the trading schemes and all of these free emissions allocations that they gave to polluters and all of these other things, it allowed like a huge increase in emissions. It was sort of sold as this cap that was going to kind of ratchet down and ratchet down and ratchet down. But when you looked at all the offsetting, both domestically and internationally, various other sorts of price off ramps, and all the free allocations that they were giving, it allowed for just massive expansion of U.S. emissions. So that was maybe my second cancellation. Like the first one was the death of environmentalism. The second one was actually kind of showing what the real numbers on the cap and trade bill were. The third one was coming out as pro-nuclear. And it turns out, this is amazing statistic, that U.S. emissions today are still like vastly below, very, very significantly below what they would have been, what would have been allowed under the Waxman-Markey caps. And remember that we were like, because we were giving these allocations away for free, like it would have just incentivized, like the biggest driver of that remains the coal to gas transition, where we have all this cheap gas, so we closed all these coal plants in the U.S. And literally the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill, because it gave so much of what was really a very valuable pollution right to polluters, would have subsidized them to keep these coal plants open. So U.S. emissions today, had Waxman-Markey passed, almost certainly would be significantly higher than they are.
Wow, and that was Obama's like flagship climate
this
legislation,
was the like Obama came in and like kind of ran on the Breakthrough Institute program, right? We're going to build this new clean energy economy. We're going to invest in the new clean energy economy. But then like when it came time to like go actually kind of do a climate bill in the U.S. Congress, the environmental groups, and this was like really before there was really a climate movement, this was just the Sierra Club and the old line groups that kind of gained power, particularly, and almost exclusively in the Democratic Party in the U.S. from the 1970s onward, were kind of really going to drive that program. And they wanted a cap and trade program. They were back then, it's ironic because now they all take credit and claim that the IRA, before it was repealed, was the most important climate legislation, transformational, and all of that. Well, all those groups were like highly, highly skeptical of that approach to the problem. And they just saw climate change as just a big kind of an air pollution problem on steroids that you would just basically regulate. And then after 1990, when Congress sort of shifted the air pollution regime to this market-based cap and trade program, they all were like, yeah, that's how we'll solve climate change, is with this market-based cap and trade program. So that's, despite Obama literally running like, I'm going to like save the U.S. economy by investing in this, all the new jobs and all the new opportunity that would come with this new clean, and there were lots of things to be skeptical about some of the claims that were made there. And I bear some responsibility as sort of one of the people who kind of created that whole argument about how to solve climate change. But that's what he ran on. But like the actual vehicle for dealing with it was a pretty old school environmental approach.
So where have we ended up now with Trump? I mean, what's your take on the current administration's energy policy and what impact it might have on US emissions and the climate generally?
I mean, the amazing thing is that if you kind of pull back and you look at, just to take the US, but it's true globally as well, if you look at just the rate of US decarbonization going back to, certainly at the very least back to the oil embargo, the 1973, the first oil embargo, when suddenly everyone's like, holy crap, we have an energy crisis. We need to pay much more attention to energy. The rate of decarbonization in the U.S. has been steady and consistent for decades, for literally 50 years, and has been kind of pretty robust and at least apparently unaffected by Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, by sort of periods of kind of green enthusiasm and periods of retrenchment. So I certainly think in the sort of medium term, we will look back, even if you take the sort of 2020 and the pandemic kind of real collapse of emissions out of it. U.S. emissions fell faster annually on an annualized basis in the first Trump administration than they did during either the two terms of the Obama administration or the Biden administration.
That's crazy. So, like, policy has no relevance at all in terms of.
I mean, I would have a slightly a more nuanced view of it, which is that what really matters for in terms of the policy really only matters insofar as it's sort of having a real impact on the long-term rate of technological change. So if I kind of go and I forget about administrations, forget about climate targets that they adopted and then they got rid of, and was they in Paris or out of Paris, in Kyoto or out of Kyoto, all of that stuff. And I go, well, what's driving this decarbonization? Certainly on the energy supply side, it's been a set of things that have had very substantial policy support going back for decades. It's 20% of the U.S. electrical system comes from nuclear energy. And that doesn't happen without policy that goes all the way back to the 1950s. If you go and you look at like the coal to gas transition and the shale gas revolution, that was policy. I mean, it was private sector was innovative and did all the private sector things, but there was huge policy support for it, including like production tax credit for non-conventional gas production for over 20 years in the 1980s and 1990s. Huge investments in demonstration tech projects and technologies by national laboratories, all of that. And again, you say the same for solar and wind and batteries. So, you know, the thing that will determine, and electric vehicles and literally everything that you go like is contributing to decarbonization, might contribute on the sort of supply emission side to decarbonization over the long term, as well as a bunch of the energy efficiency, heat pumps. Literally all of this stuff has had long-term policy support of one type or another. And the stuff that's most important is the sort of early stage, getting these things commercialized into market. Once they're kind of commercialized into market, you can keep throwing subsidies at it and do sort of various sorts of deployment mandates. But the main event is kind of getting to the point where you have a reasonably commercially competitive technology. So I look at the Trump administration on the one hand, like wind deployment was really flagging in the U.S. even before Trump. Commodity prices, permitting, and there were a whole bunch of other obstacles that just were making it really hard. And like literally big wind companies trying to sort of develop offshore wind in the U.S. were literally canceling projects all through the Biden administration because literally like they just couldn't get them to pencil out, even with quite generous subsidies. Solar is a whole different story. And there's tariffs and other things that are kind of making that a bit more difficult. But I think we'll see record solar deployment this year, and maybe it won't grow quite as fast as it might otherwise in the next.
You mean you're talking in the U.S. still, not
in the U.S. In the
okay.
U.S. So there's still going to be, even with Trump kind of getting rid of all the subsidies and whatever, there's going to be a lot of solar deployment. So then you kind of go, well, what's next, right? I think there'll be a lot of almost all solar that's being deployed in the U.S. now is being deployed with batteries. And there's still quite significant subsidies for battery storage that survived the kind of repeal of the IRA, which was not fully repealed. In the next 5 years, we'll start to see this next generation of geothermal coming online, which will provide what people call clean, firm generation, stuff that's not variable and that you can kind of actually produce electricity on demand. Arguably, the biggest thing positively that the Trump administration is doing affecting climate is it's just they're kind of all in on nuclear in a way that no U.S. president or administration really since Eisenhower has been. I mean, I think there are some real risks there of just sort of kind of trying to push things that aren't really ready and sort of losing public confidence and things like that. So I don't want to say it's all roses here, but I do think that this administration is going to actually get some next generation reactors deployed in the next 4 years, which no one thought was possible. And they're going to kind of
be like a kind of nuclear version of warp speed.
Yes, it really is. And they've now got Bobby Kennedy Jr. at HHS trying to undo everything that they did, which is insane. But literally, we can thank Trump for the COVID vaccine and for, I think one way or another is probably going to be a real revolution just more broadly in mRNA.
In cancer treatments and all sorts of things.
Yeah, kind of quite remarkable possibilities here, and they're coming really fast. So there is a world here where despite all of this, actually Trump, despite getting in front of the UN and calling climate change a hoax, this administration actually ends up getting a bunch of nuclear and geothermal deployed that accelerates decarbonization in the US and maybe even globally. Hindsight's 2020. And I think that,
why do they, sorry to interrupt, why do they even like nuclear? I mean, they don't care about the climate. It's not about decarbonization. What's the motivating factor? Is it to own the libs? I mean, some kind of culture war thing?
There's an own the libs part of it. I think to give kind of people on the right a bit more credit, I just think there's a view that energy density and a sort of scale and firm, reliable power matter in a way that I think the left and liberals get kind of captured by the Amory Lovins soft energy path.
Which is, for those who don't know, just give us a quick...
Yeah, this is the idea that wind, solar, energy efficiency, and batteries basically can power the whole world, can meet all of our energy needs. And it's always been a pretty preposterous idea when you really kind of look at all the different ways that we use energy. But that has been the sort of default. Every energy plan produced by literally every environmental, kind of, again, according to Hoyle, environmental organization, for 50 years has been one version or another of the soft energy.
Yeah, it's been 100% renewables for sure. Although I have to say that's less wrong than I originally thought, given how rapidly solar and batteries have come down in price and how... That's not the same as going to 100%, of course.
It's going to be, I think cheap solar is an amazing thing, and it is not remotely going to approach or ever approach 100%. It's just implausible. Between the variability, between the need for heat in all sorts of really important industrial processes, this is not going to happen. And I think that cheap solar, a lot of really cheap solar with a lot of really cheap batteries, will get further than I probably would have thought 15 years ago when I really sort of became a real full-throated nuclear advocate. But that is it's just sort of part of the puzzle. It's not the whole puzzle, and it's never going to be the whole puzzle.
Another part of the puzzle is that the climate doomists tend to be anti-nuclear, which doesn't sort of stack up, right? If you were that worried about the impacts of climate change killing 1 billion, 2 billion people, you wouldn't be against low-carbon energy.
And literally, now it kind of, you go read a Bill McKibben or someone like that, and they're like, no, I'm not anti-nuclear. It's just the solar is so cheap, it's a waste of time and waste of money to build more nuclear. And now, and this is the change, the change is that now they're but don't close the nuclear.
Yeah, Bill said, maybe you heard it, Bill said this on this very podcast only a couple of episodes ago, which I think was a shift for him. It was saying don't close the nuclear, and it may have a role, which I felt was a shift.
No, it's sort of a shift. You could call it a shift. You could also call it a rearguard action, but because I kind of it's really what's happened in the last decade, thanks to your work and mine and a bunch of other people, is that it's just you can still sort of maintain some kind of credibility and say nuclear is just too expensive to build more of it. And we've got all this cheap solar, so we should do that. It's faster, it's cheaper, or whatever. But the thing that is just totally uncredible and indefensible at this point is to still be advocating for closing nuclear plants that are actually literally creating clean energy today.
Like the German Greens have done. In fact, we're just about to release a report quantifying the number of additional deaths from air pollution and millions of tons of carbon dioxide that have been released as a result. I mean, it's frankly incredible. Listen, I don't want to close without going back to the climate just one last time, though. Give us, is there something that could happen in the climate that would make you worried again and make you a catastrophist again?
I mean, I would have to get more convinced that you could see really rapid climate change and climate change in terms of at the level of hazards that actually affect human population. If you told me we're going to see 2 meters of sea level rise in a decade or two, I would be very concerned. If you told me that warming could accelerate in a way that agriculture, large swaths of agriculture would become unviable in sort of decadal timescales, I would be very concerned. I think when we start talking century, or when we get to a lot of these tipping points, one of the things that nobody talks about is that you look at these tipping elements, is I think now the term of art, not tipping points, because they are in some cases irreversible, but they happen over hundreds or even thousands of years. So you look at you can get to sort of a faster disintegration of the Greenland ice shelf, but even kind of pretty fast disintegration, it's 800 to 1,000 years.
It's a few centuries, I agree.
Yeah. West Antarctic ice shelf is several thousand years.
What's incredible is some of the geoengineering proponents are talking about stabilizing ice sheets artificially with curtains under the water and all these kind of crazy schemes. And that's presumably predicated on the fact that they think these things are happening in a desperately catastrophic, immediate sense, right? And having looked at the rate of warming of the planet and the fact we're crossing 1.5 in maybe this year, maybe next year, maybe a couple of years hence, the only physically plausible way actually to keep the planet at 1.5 is probably to do geoengineering, particularly given that we're doing the opposite at the moment by removing sulfate pollutants from shipping fuels and coal-fired power stations and so on. You mentioned earlier on, I just want to end with this, where do you come down on that issue?
I mean, I have become more and more skeptical about geoengineering. And the reason for that is that the thing that I have catastrophist, the thing where you can get me back to being a catastrophist is rapid climate change. Again, decadal scale, very significant.
Maybe termination shock then.
Yes. I think the most plausible scenario for climate catastrophe is that we start geoengineering and then we stop. And it would both be ironic and somehow predictable that the impact of the climate catastrophism would be to create the climate catastrophe, because basically you get everybody so freaked out by these what are pretty implausible fears that anthropogenic warming due to greenhouse gas emissions is going to very rapidly change the climate and kill us all, that we convince the world to start geoengineering. And then once you start, you really can't stop until you've basically gotten rid of all fossil fuel emissions. And there's all sorts of ways in which it's entirely plausible to see various sorts of geopolitical, social, other kinds of conflicts resulting in actually stopping, at which point you do get really rapid climate change. And that, for me, is that's where I'm you get me catastrophic there.
Wow. Well, so climate catastrophism can cause the climate catastrophe via geoengineering. Producer Rob's an advocate of geoengineering, but he's on mute. You can't hear him, so he can't defend himself here. But I'm just so grateful to you, Ted, for all your time and for all your insights. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I think a lot of people will have learned a lot from it. We're not going to cancel you. In fact, we'd love to have you back. And keep up the good work.
Always happy to do it, Mark.
Definitely. And keep up the good work with the Breakthrough Institute. And thanks again for coming on Saving the World from Bad Ideas. Thanks so much for listening to Saving the World from Bad Ideas, a We Planet podcast. We Planet's a movement of citizens and scientists dedicated to defending the science and solutions we need to save the world. Please do subscribe and share a nice review. It helps us spread the message. We'd also love to hear your feedback and suggestions at our email, podcast@weplanet.org. Please also join our podcast mailing list and we'll let you know when a new episode drops. Just go to savingtheworldfrombadideas.org or weplanet.org/podcast right now. See you next time.